At the age of 16, she was kicked out of the house at a time when she needed it most. Crying, still in her school uniform, she heard her mother's cry, "Here, you never come back." Alone and pregnant, she wandered the streets until the baby's father's last name came to light. And when the family found out who he was, desperation made them beg for forgiveness. But it was too late. During a dinner that was supposed to be a celebration of high school graduation, Emily Miller, at the age of 16, was sitting at the table with her parents, Susan and David Miller, when she finally gained the courage to tell the truth she had kept for 3 months. The table was set with the best crockery in the family, porcelain, plates with golden rims that only came out of the closet on special occasions. Susan had prepared David's favorite steak, creamy mashed potatoes, and green salad. Scented candles burned in the center of the table, creating an atmosphere that was supposed to be festive, but that to Emily seemed heavy as lead. "Father, Mother, I need to tell you something," she said with her voice shaking, her hands sweaty and her heart beating so hard that it seemed to want to come out of her chest. David Miller, a respected accountant in the community for more than 20 years, stopped cutting his steak and looked up, curious. His brows furrowed slightly. He knew his daughter well enough to know when something was wrong. "What's wrong, daughter? Any problems at school? Didn't you pass any subject?" Emily swallowed. Her hands trembled so much that she had to hide them under the table. "For weeks I had rehearsed this moment, but now that I was here, all the carefully prepared words seemed to have evaporated. It's not about school, Dad. It's about me." Susan stopped chewing and looked intently at her daughter. As a mother, I had noticed some changes in Emily in recent weeks. She looked paler, more tired, and sometimes ran to the bathroom in the morning. But Susan had attributed it to the stress of graduation. "Emily, you're making me worried. What happened?" asked Susan, putting her fork on her plate. Emily took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then said the words that changed everything. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound in the room was the ticking of Grandma's wall clock, which suddenly sounded loud like drum beats. Susan dropped her fork on her plate with a metallic noise that echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. David froze with the piece of meat halfway to his mouth, his eyes slowly widening. "What's it like?" roared David after a few seconds that seemed eternal, his voice charged with incredulity and growing fury. "You said what?" Emily felt tears start to form in her eyes, but she forced her voice out again. "I'm pregnant, Dad. 3 months." Susan rose from her chair as if she had been given an electric shock. The chair scraped against the wooden floor, producing a harsh sound that cut through the air. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, and she brought one of them to her mouth, as if she could push back the words she had just heard. "No, no, no," Susan repeated like a mantra, shaking her head vigorously. "This cannot be happening. Not in my house. Not with my daughter. Not with the daughter I raised to be a good girl. Mom, don't call me Mom," cried Susan, her face turning red with anger and shame. His words came out like whippings. "A daughter of mine wouldn't do such a thing. A daughter of mine would not bring this shame to the family. A daughter of mine would know how to behave like a lady." Emily recoiled in her chair as if she had been physically assaulted. Her mother's words hurt more than any slap. David stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. He was a man of average height, but at that moment he seemed immense to Emily. Her eyes were filled with a fury she had never seen before, not even in the worst fights between her parents. "Who's the father?" David's voice came out low, controlled, but loaded with menace. "Who was the bastard who did this to you? Who was the bastard who took advantage of my daughter?" Emily lowered her eyes, tears now rolling freely down her cheeks. "I can't talk. Can't or won't you?" David advanced towards her, his voice growing louder. "You've destroyed our reputation, our family, tarnished the Miller's name in this town, and you still want to protect this bum?" "It's not like that, Dad. He doesn't know. He's not even here anymore." Susan began to pacing up and down the room, her hands in her hair messing up the hairstyle she had so carefully made for dinner. She muttered to herself like a person on the verge of a nervous breakdown. What are they going to say in the church? What will Pastor William say? What will the neighbors say? Mrs. Peterson, Mrs. Martha? My God, what are they going to say about your father's work? She stopped walking and looked directly at Emily, her eyes full of tears and an expression of despair. The Miller family has always been respected in this town, Emily. We have always been good people, family people, people who go to church every Sunday. His father is an accountant for half of the companies in the city. I have been a church secretary for 15 years. And you? You destroyed all of that in one night. Mom, please listen to me. No. Susan turned to Emily with a fury that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. You didn't think about any of this when you were doing this. This dirt. Didn't you think about the family? Didn't you think of us? Haven't you thought about the education we gave you? The values we tried to teach you? David took a deep breath, trying to control himself. He ran his hands through his hair several times, a gesture that Emily recognized as a sign that he was trying not to explode completely. Emily, he said finally, his voice ice cold, you have two options and only two. Either you get rid of this child or you get rid of our house. Emily felt the world come crashing down around her. Her legs became weak, and she had to hold on to the table to keep from falling. Dad, you're not serious. Please tell me you're not serious. I'm more serious than I've ever been in my life. David crossed his arms, his expression hard as stone. I will not allow you to turn our family into a reason for gossip and shame. I will not allow you to destroy everything we have built here. Emily got up from her chair, her legs wobbly, and tried to approach her father with her hands outstretched. Begging, David, please, Emily pleaded, using her father's name for the first time in her life. I know I made a mistake. I know you are so disappointed, but it's your grandson. It's your family. It's your blood. My family doesn't include bastard children. David spat out the words as venom. My family does not include the result of my daughter's promiscuity. Susan stopped walking and looked at Emily with a contempt that cut deeper than any knife. Do you think we're going to support you and this baby? That we are going to accept this scandal in our house? That we're going to pretend that everything is fine, while the whole city talks behind our backs? You were completely wrong, girl. But Mom, I have nowhere to go. I don't know how to do anything. I am a minor. I am your daughter. I should have thought of that before I spread my legs to anyone, Susan replied with a cruelty that cut Emily like a sharp knife. Emily fell to her knees on the living room floor, sobbing like a child. The wooden floor was cold against her legs, but she barely felt it. The emotional pain was far greater than any physical discomfort. Please don't do this to me. I love you. You are my parents. You are all I have in the world. I don't have anyone else. David walked up the stairs to the second floor, climbed a few steps, and shouted without looking back, You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Either get rid of this child or disappear from our sight. And Emily, if you choose to stay with this child, never step foot in this house again. Never again. That night, Emily was locked in the room that had been her refuge all her life. The pink walls she had picked out at 12, the teddy bears arranged on the shelf, the school merit honors hanging on the wall. Everything seemed to belong to someone else, to a girl who no longer existed. She heard her parents arguing downstairs. Voices rose and fell in waves of anger and despair, but she could hear loose words that cut through her like knives. Shame, reputation, a scandal, disappointment. How are we going to show our faces in church? What am I going to say at work? At one point, he heard Susan crying uncontrollably. David, she's our daughter, our only daughter. How are we going to live without it? She's not our daughter anymore, David replied with a coldness Emily had never heard before. Our daughter died tonight at the dinner table. Emily put her hand on her belly, where a little life was growing, and whispered in the dark, Sorry, baby. Mom didn't want you to arrive in a world like that. But I'll protect you, I promise, even if it's just the two of us against the world. In the morning, when he went down to the cafe, he found a suitcase already ready in the living room. It was his old suitcase, the same one he used when he went camping with school. Next to it there was an envelope with some money. Have you decided? Asked David dryly, sipping coffee as if it were any other day. He didn't look her in the eye even once. Emily held her belly instinctively, feeling for the first time the real responsibility of the little life that grew inside. I can't do that, Dad. I can't kill my baby. I can't take the life of an innocent child. Susan got up from the table, picked up the suitcase and pushed it toward Emily harder than necessary. So you've already decided for us too? Emily picked up the suitcase with trembling hands. She looked around the house where she had grown up, the kitchen where her mother had taught her how to bake cookies, the living room where they watched movies on Sundays, the garden where she had played with dolls. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice coming out stronger than she expected. "One day you will understand that you did the wrong thing. One day you'll want to meet your grandson and find out it's too late." David laughed humorlessly, a bitter sound that Emily would never forget. "The only thing wrong here was that you were born. The only thing I regret is raising a daughter who disappointed me so much." The door closed behind Emily, with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. She stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, 3 months pregnant, with a suitcase in her hand and nowhere to go. Neighbors began to leave their homes to go to work. Mrs. Peterson, who always greeted her fondly, crossed the street to avoid her. Mr. Johnson, who mowed the lawn every morning, hurried into the house when he saw her. Emily understood that the news had already spread. In small towns, scandals travel faster than light. With a heavy suitcase in her hand and an even heavier heart in her chest, Emily Miller began to walk. She didn't know where, but she knew that from that moment on, she and her baby only had each other, and it would be enough. It would have to be. Emily walked the streets of the small town where she had grown up, carrying the heavy suitcase and feeling the weight of the discerning gaze of the neighbors. It was one of those cities where everyone has known each other forever, where secrets are impossible to keep, and where the reputation of families is built over generations. Each person who passed by seemed to whisper something about her. Mrs. Martinez, who always sold candy on the corner, looked away as Emily approached. Mr. Thompson, who owned the pharmacy where Emily had been buying medicine since she was a child, closed the door quickly when he saw her pass. It was as if she had become invisible and at the same time the center of all attention. The shopping bag seemed to weigh tons in his arms. The May sun was strong, and Emily felt the sweat running down her back, mixing with the tears that insisted on welling up. With each step, the reality of her situation became more concrete. She was completely alone in the world. The first place she looked was the house of her best friend, Jessica Crawford. They had been inseparable since 5th grade, sharing secrets, dreams, and plans for the future. If anyone in the world would understand her, it would be Jessica. The Crawfords' house was one of the most beautiful on the street. 2 floors, manicured garden, white picket fence, that always seemed to Emily the symbol of the perfect family. He rang the bell with hope, his heart pounding. Maybe Jessica could convince her parents to let her stay at least a few days. Mrs. Crawford opened the door, and Emily saw at once that her hope was groundless. The woman who had always treated her like a second daughter now looked at her with a mixture of pity and disapproval. "Emily, honey, I heard what happened," the woman said in a tone of false compassion. "Keeping the door only ajar. The whole city is already commenting. Your mother called several church families this morning." Emily felt her stomach tighten. Susan had actually spread the word, ensuring that she would not find shelter anywhere. "Mrs. Crawford, I have nowhere to go. Could I stay here just for a few days? I promise I won't bother." The woman sighed deeply, looking nervously behind her, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "Emily, you understand that I can't let you stay here, do you? I have to think about my own daughter, the influence that this can have on Jessica. She's only 17, it's a very impressionable age." Emily felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. "But Mrs. Crawford, you have known me since I was little. You know I'm not a bad person. I know, honey, I know. But circumstances have changed. You made choices, adult, and now he has to deal with the adult consequences of these choices." The door closed before Emily could answer. She stood on the porch for a few minutes, trying to process that the family that had always treated her like a daughter now completely rejected her. He tried 4 more houses of family acquaintances. At the Morrison house, they didn't even open the door. She saw the curtain move, but no one answered despite the insistent doorbell. In the Peterson home, Mr. Peterson opened the door only a crack and said dryly, "My wife is not feeling well enough to have visitors." At the Williams home, ironically, the pastor's house, Mrs. Williams greeted her on the porch but did not invite her in. "Emily, my daughter," said the pastor's wife in a voice that tried to sound motherly, but which Emily realized was charged with judgment. "What you have done is a grave sin in the eyes of the Lord, but there is salvation for all who truly repent." "I don't regret having my baby," Emily replied with a firmness that surprised her. Mrs. Williams frowned. "Then you have not yet understood the gravity of your spiritual situation. I will pray for you, But I cannot offer support to those who do not recognize their mistakes. In all the houses, the answer was the same: closed doors, polite apologies, judgmental looks. The small conservative town where she had been born had no place for a pregnant teenager without a family. When evening came, Emily was sitting in a deserted square under a tree that offered little shade. Her feet ached from walking, and her belly was already growling with hunger. He had eaten only one sandwich for breakfast before the expulsion, and now he felt a weakness that went beyond physical hunger. He opened the suitcase and checked what was inside. Some clothes, toiletries, and the envelope with money that the parents had left. He counted carefully $23. Everything he owned in the world. "Sorry, baby," she whispered, touching her belly that still showed no visible signs of pregnancy. "Mom doesn't really know what to do now. But I'll find out, I promise." A group of teenagers passed through the square, schoolmates whom Emily recognized immediately. They saw her and began to whisper to each other, casting glances in her direction. Emily heard fragments of the conversation. Pregnant? Expelled from home? What a shame. One of the boys, Mark Peterson, approached her with a cruel smile. "What's up, Emily? I heard you're, how can I say, in an interesting situation." Emily stood up, picking up her suitcase. "Leave me alone, Mark." Wow, what hostility. "I just wanted to know who is the lucky one who is going to be a dad." "Or don't you know?" The others laughed, and Emily felt her face burn with shame and anger. "Go away, Mark. It's none of your business. In fact, it is our business. After all, you are now part of our city's statistics. Teenage single mom. What an upbuilding example." Emily started to walk away, but Mark yelled behind her, "Hey, Emily, if you need help finding work, I know of a few places that hire women like you." The group's laughter echoed in the empty square, following Emily as she walked away as fast as she could. It was then that he remembered the shelter for homeless people on the other side of the city. It was a place I had vaguely heard about, where people like that stayed when they had nowhere else to go. He never imagined that one day he would need to know where he was. With the suitcase in her hand, and her feet already forming blisters inside her school shoes, she began the long walk. The shelter was in the poorest part of town, a place the Millers had always avoided. The streets were narrower, the houses smaller and poorly maintained, and Emily felt more and more out of her element. The shelter was an old, poorly maintained building that had been an elementary school decades ago. The paint on the walls was peeling, some windows were cracked and taped, and there was a line of people waiting at the door. Men in shabby clothes, women with blank stares, some clearly high on drugs or alcohol. Emily hesitated. That wasn't the kind of place where a girl like her should be. But when he looked around and saw that he had no alternative, he swallowed his pride and placed himself at the end of the line. The line moved slowly. The people in front of her were talking quietly about things Emily didn't understand: where to get food, which streets were safest to sleep on, how to avoid the police. It was a completely different world from the one she knew. Beside her in line, an older woman, with clothes that had once been good but were now stained and torn, and shaggy grey hair, looked her up and down curiously. "First time, right?" asked the woman with a toothless smile who tried to be gentle. Emily just nodded, not trusting her own voice. "I'm Dolores. I've been here for about 6 months. You look too young to be here. How old are you?" 16, Emily muttered. Dolores whistled softly. "My God, child. What happened? Did you run away from home?" "Something like that," Emily replied, not wanting to go into detail. "Don't worry, honey. The first night is always the worst. Then you get used to it, and here we take care of ourselves. It's like a weird family, but it's family." When she finally managed to get in, Emily was directed by a tired employee to a dorm room with bunk beds lined up. The smell was a mixture of cheap disinfectant, sweat, reheated food, and something indefinable that Emily later learned was the smell of despair. The girls' dormitory had 20 beds, almost all of them occupied. Women of all ages, some clearly mentally ill, others who seemed to be there only temporarily. Like Emily, she chose a bed in the corner as far away from the others as possible, and sat on the edge of the thin, hard mattress. The sheet was clean, but it had yellowish stains that no longer came out. "Hey, Nova," a harsh voice called. Emily looked and saw a middle-aged woman with oxygenated hair and a hard look. "That bed was Margie's. She died last week, overdose." Emily felt a shiver. Sorry, I didn't know. Relax, Margie wouldn't mind. She was good people. He was just unlucky in life, like most of us here, lying on the thin, hard mattress, listening to the snoring, coughing, and whispering of the other residents. Emily put her hand on her belly and made a silent promise. I'll take care of you, baby. I don't know how, but I'll find a way. You won't grow up in this place. I promise. The first few weeks at the shelter were the hardest of Emily's life. During the day, she looked for work, walking from store to store, from office to office. But no one wanted to hire a pregnant teenager with no experience and no references. Look, honey, said the manager of a diner, you seem like a good girl, but I can't risk hiring someone who's going to have to go on leave in a few months. It's a matter of business, you understand. At the pharmacy, where she always bought medicine with her family, Mr. Thompson wouldn't let her finish talking. Emily, I can't help you. It would be very embarrassing for everyone involved. At night, she returned to the shelter more and more discouraged. The food was basic: thin soup, crusty bread, overcooked vegetables, but that's what there was. Emily tried to eat it all, thinking about the baby growing inside her. The other residents of the shelter began to get used to her. Dolores became a kind of surrogate mother, teaching Emily about the unwritten rules of the place. Never leave your belongings unattended, Dolores advised. Whenever you take a shower, take everything with you. And if someone bothers you, shout loudly. The employees come running. Sarah, a 22-year-old who was there with 2 young daughters, shared stories that made Emily realize that her situation could be even worse. My ex-husband beat me, Sarah recounted one night while cradling her youngest daughter. One day he hit my 3-year-old daughter because she spilled juice on the couch. That's when I knew I had to leave the house. And your family? Didn't it help you? Asked Emily. Sarah laughed bitterly. My family said I had to put up with it. That marriage is just like that. That I had to think about the children and not be selfish. Emily began to understand that there were many ways for a family to abandon someone. When she was in her 4th month of pregnancy, Emily finally got a part-time job cleaning offices at night. The work was too heavy for a pregnant woman. She had to carry heavy buckets of water, get on her knees cleaning toilets, and deal with chemicals that made her eyes sting. But it was work, and it meant money. $5 an hour, 4 hours a night, 5 nights a week, $100 a week, a fortune for someone who had started with $23. The work began at 11 in the evening and ended at 3 in the morning. Emily cleaned 3 small offices downtown, always afraid of being seen by someone she knew. She wore a cap to hide her hair and loose clothes to disguise her belly that was beginning to grow. The nights were long and lonely. Emily spent the early hours alone in these empty offices, cleaning bathrooms, vacuuming carpets, and emptying trash cans. Her back hurt, her feet swelled, and sometimes she felt dizzy that forced her to sit on the floor until she passed. Hold on, baby, she whispered to her belly. It's only temporary. Mommy will get something better. During the day, he tried to rest in the shelter, but it was difficult to sleep with the constant noise. Some women cried, others talked to themselves. And there were always arguments about small things: who used the bathroom for too long, who took soap from whom. It was through Linda, a social worker who visited the shelter weekly, that Emily discovered a government program for teenage single mothers. It's a long process, Linda explained, sitting in a small, stuffy room that served as an office. You will need to prove income, do interviews, undergo psychological evaluations, but if it is approved, it can get a subsidized apartment. Emily filled out forms for weeks. He answered personal questions about his life, his family, his prospects for the future. She went through interviews where social workers asked things like, "Are you sure you're ready to be a mother?" And, "Have you considered adoption as an option?" "I want my baby," Emily always replied. "I'll do whatever it takes to take care of him." The process took 3 months. 3 months of uncertainty, of nights cleaning offices, of days trying to rest in the noisy shelter. 3 months watching her belly grow and feeling the baby's first movements. When she finally received approval, Emily cried with relief. It would be a small apartment in a peripheral neighborhood, but it would be hers, a place where she and her baby could start a new life. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building, with no elevator. It had only 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen with a refrigerator that made too much noise, and a stove that only worked 2 burners, a bathroom with a shower that sometimes came out cold water, sometimes boiling, But for Emily, it was a palace. For the first time in months, he had privacy. She could take a shower without haste, sleep without fear of being stolen, cook her own food. With the money he had saved from cleaning work, he bought used furniture, a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a second-hand refrigerator. At a second-hand baby supply store, he found a crib that needed some repairs, but was structurally sound. He spent his free afternoons sanding the crib, painting it with a white paint he bought at a discount, sewing small sheets from cheap fabrics he found in a patchwork store. It was a meticulous work done with love and hope. In the 7th month of pregnancy, Emily got a better job, a receptionist at a small veterinary clinic. Dr. Martins, the veterinarian who hired her, was an older man who had lost his daughter in a car accident. "Everyone deserves a second chance," was all he said when Emily honestly told her story during the interview. The work was during the day, which meant that Emily could have normal nights of sleep. "I answered phones, made appointments, organized files. It was a respectable job, which gave him dignity." In the 8th month of pregnancy, while assembling the crib in the little room she had prepared with so much care, Emily felt the first contractions. They were weak and irregular at first, but as the hours passed, they grew stronger and more frequent. She took the bus alone to the public hospital, holding her belly and breathing, as she had learned in the childbirth preparation classes she attended for free at the health center. During the 20-minute drive, the contractions intensified, and Emily had to hold on to the seat so as not to scream. At the hospital, she was quickly attended to and taken to the delivery room. The labor was long and hard, 14 hours of labor, during which Emily had no one to hold her hand, no one to encourage her through the strongest contractions. The nurses were professional, but clearly overworked. They went in and out checking his dilation with technical haste, adjusting the serum, measuring the pressure. Emily felt completely alone at the most important moment of her life. "Do you have someone to call?" one of the nurses asked during a break between contractions. Emily shook her head, not trusting her voice to answer. When she finally heard the baby's first cry, Emily broke down in tears of relief, pain, exhaustion, and instant love. He was a boy, perfect and healthy, with light brown hair and eyes that seemed to know secrets of the universe. The nurse placed the baby in Emily's arms, and at that moment, all the hardships of the past few months seemed worth it. He was small, warm, and wept with a strength that filled Emily's heart with hope. "Hello, my love," Emily whispered, gently touching the perfect little face. "I'm your mommy, and you are the most beautiful thing that has ever happened in my life." But to understand how Emily had met James Robert Kennedy Jr. and why she had guarded this secret so zealously, we need to go back a year ago, when she was still an ordinary student in a middle-class school. Emily has always been an introverted girl, dedicated to her studies and with few friends. He didn't come from a wealthy family, but the Millers had a solid reputation in the community. David had worked as an accountant for more than 20 years at the same company, and Susan was a secretary at the local church. They were conservative religious people who proudly saw their studious and well-behaved daughter. In October of their senior year of high school, the school hosted a charity event to raise funds for children in need. It was an elegant gala with dinner and auction, which took place in the main hall of the school. Emily had volunteered to help with the organization, as she always did. On the night of the event, while helping to greet guests at the entrance, Emily saw a young man arrive who immediately caught her attention. Tall, well-cut brown hair, wearing a suit that clearly cost more than her entire wardrobe. There was something different about him, a natural elegance that Emily had never seen in boys her age. "Excuse me," he said, approaching her with a gentle smile. "Could you tell me where I can leave my donation for the auction?" Emily was nervous. He had a soft, polite voice, and his blue eyes seemed genuinely interested in helping. "Of course, it's there on that table," she stammered, pointing to the back of the room. "Thank you. Do you study here?" "Yes, last year. I should be too, but I study at a private school on the other side of the city. I came here because my family always supports charitable causes. I'm James, by the way." "Emily," she replied, feeling her cheeks warm. James smiled again. "Nice to meet you, Emily." Throughout the night, Emily noticed that James was watching her. When he finished his duties as a volunteer, he approached again. "Would you like to have a little punch with me? I promise I won't monopolize your time all night." Emily looked around, looking for her parents, but they were on the other side of the room, talking to other couples in the church. "It's okay," she said shyly. They spent more than an hour talking. James was unlike any boy Emily knew. He talked about trips to Europe, about prestigious universities, about plans to study business and one day manage the family business. But he didn't speak presumptuously. There was a genuine gentleness to his words. "And you? What are your plans for after graduation?" asked James. Emily felt ashamed. His plans were simple. Maybe get a scholarship at a local university. Maybe work at his father's company. Nothing compared to James's grandiose dreams. "I'm still deciding," she said diplomatically. "I'm sure you'll do well in anything you choose," James replied with sincerity that made her blush again. When the event ended, James asked for Emily's number. "I would love to talk to you again. Maybe we can have a coffee someday." Emily gave her the number, little believing that a boy like that was interested in her. Over the next few days, James called several times. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. He said he was in his city only temporarily, helping his grandfather with some business. Emily fell in love not only with his beauty and education, but with the attention he gave her, the way he made her feel special. They began to meet in secret. Emily knew her parents would never approve. James was clearly from a very different social class to theirs. They met in the park, in a cafeteria far from the center, always away from familiar eyes. After 3 weeks of meetings one afternoon in November, James took Emily to a house he said belonged to his grandfather, in the city's countryside. It was an elegant property with manicured gardens and stunning views. "My grandparents aren't here this week," James explained. "I thought you'd like to see the sunset from up here." Emily had never been in such a beautiful place. They sat on the porch talking and laughing, and when James kissed her, she felt like she was living in a fairy tale. One thing led to another. Emily was a virgin, inexperienced, but she was completely in love. That afternoon she gave herself to James with all the love and innocence she had. "I love you, Emily," James whispered in her ears. "You're special, different from all the girls I've met." Emily believed every word. In the following days, James became more distant. Calls have decreased, meetings have become rarer. When Emily tried to talk about what had happened between them, James would change the subject or say they needed to take it slow. 2 weeks later, Emily found out from a schoolmate that James had left town. "I heard he went back to his private school," the girl said casually. "It seems that I was only here temporarily." Emily was devastated. He tried to call his number, but he was disconnected. She spent weeks waiting for him to appear, to explain the disappearance, to return to her. That's when she realized that her period was late. 2 years had passed since Emily had given birth to little James. Life was hard, but she had found a routine. "I worked in a small accounting firm during the day and studied accounting at night in a technical course." Little James was a healthy and cheerful child who was already speaking his first words and taking his first steps. Emily had learned to live without help from her family. On special dates, her son's birthday, Christmas, Mother's Day, a part of her still waited for her parents to show up, to ask for forgiveness, to want to meet their grandson. But that never happened. On a Tuesday in March, Emily was at home eating dinner for James when the local news caught her eye. She always left the TV on to keep her company, but she rarely paid attention to the news. This time, something made her stop what she was doing. "In our special report tonight," the presenter said, "we will talk about unknown heirs of great fortunes, a phenomenon more common than one might think, especially among traditional families with businesses spread throughout the country." Emily paused with the spoonful of baby food halfway to James's mouth. "Our first case is the Kennedy family," the reporter continued, "one of the wealthiest business dynasties in the state, owning a chain of hotels and real estate developments valued at more than $2 billion. Emily's heart began to race. Exactly 1 year ago, James Robert Kennedy Jr., the only direct heir to the family fortune, died in a car accident in Los Angeles, where he was studying business. The 19-year-old was the son of Robert Kennedy Sr., the family's current patriarch. Emily dropped the spoon. Little James, noticing that his mother had stopped feeding him, began to complain. According to sources close to the family, the report continued. Private investigators were hired to verify whether James Jr. left unknown children or dependents. This search is crucial to determine the succession of the billionaire fortune. The screen showed pictures of James, the same James that Emily had known and loved. More mature than when she met him, but unmistakably the same man, the father of her child. The Kennedy family offers a substantial reward for any information that leads to the location of possible heirs, the reporter concluded before moving on to another story. Emily turned off the TV with shaking hands. She looked at little James, who was watching her with his light blue eyes, the same eyes as his father. "My God," she whispered. "My baby." "My baby is heir to billions." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. He spent hours on the internet, researching the Kennedy family. He discovered that Robert Kennedy Sr. was actually one of the richest men in the state, owner of a business empire built over decades. He saw photos of mansions, yachts, private jets, a completely different world from his own. He also found news about the death of James Jr. The accident had happened on a mountain road. James was driving home from college when he lost control of the car on a curve. He died instantly, Emily cried. She cried for the loss of her first love. She cried for the father that little James would never know. She cried for all the possibilities that were lost, but she also thought about her son's future. Little James was entitled to that inheritance. He had the right to know his father's family, to have opportunities that they could never offer. The next day, Emily called the law firm mentioned in the report. "Hello, I think I have information about a possible heir to the Kennedy family," she said nervously. "One moment, please. I'm going to transfer it to our specialized department." After a few minutes of waiting, a professional male voice answered, "This is Dr. Hamilton. Did you say you had information about an heir?" "Yes, my son. I think my son is James Kennedy Jr.'s son." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Do you have proof of this allegation?" Emily took a deep breath. "I have the birth certificate with his name as his father, and I can do a DNA test." "I see. Could you come to our office this week? We need to talk in person." On the same day that Emily spoke to the lawyers on the other side of town, David and Susan Miller watched the same news in their living room. The 2 years without Emily had been difficult. The house seemed empty. Neighbors sometimes asked for their daughter, and they had to make excuses. Susan had put on weight and developed high blood pressure problems. David drank more than he should have, but both were too proud to admit that they had made a mistake. "Do you think she's still in town?" asked Susan one night, breaking a silence that had lasted for weeks. "I don't know and I don't want to know," David replied sharply. She made her choice. But when they saw the report on the Kennedy heirs, a seed of doubt began to germinate. "David," Susan said slowly, "do you remember that Emily said the child's father was called James?" David paused with the beer halfway to his mouth. "James is a common name, Susan. But what if it were true? What if our daughter—" "No," David cut off sharply. "Let's not start with these fantasies. Emily was always dramatic. She always made things up to get attention." But even saying that, David couldn't stop thinking. What if Emily was telling the truth about who her father was? What if they had expelled from home not only their daughter, but also their grandson, who was heir to one of the largest fortunes in the country? 3 days later, Susan couldn't take it anymore. "David, I'm going to look for our daughter." "You're not going to do any of that." "Yes, I will. If there's even the slightest chance that that child is a Kennedy, we need to know." David looked at his wife and saw determination he hadn't seen in years. "And what are you going to say to her?" "Hi, daughter. I'm sorry I kicked you out of the house, but I heard you can be rich now." Susan lowered her eyes, embarrassed. "Let's find a way to get closer to her again, to say that we miss him, that we want to meet his grandson. And do you think she'll believe it?" "She is our daughter, David. She will forgive." David shook his head, but deep down he knew Susan was right about one thing. They needed to find out the truth about this child. A week after Emily's first call to the lawyers, things started to happen quickly. The DNA test confirmed what she already knew. Little James was actually the son of James Robert Kennedy Jr. The news spread like wildfire. Emily was at home on a Thursday afternoon, playing with James on the living room floor when the doorbell rang. She looked through the peephole and froze. On the other side of the door were her parents, David and Susan, holding a bouquet of flowers and a wrapped gift. "Emily? Emily, honey, it's us," Susan called in a sweet voice that Emily hadn't heard in years. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. Little James was on the floor playing with building blocks, oblivious to the tension of the moment. "What do you want?" asked Emily through the door unopened. "We want to talk, daughter," David replied. We want to apologize," Emily laughed humorlessly. "Excuses?" "After 2 years." "Please, Emily," Susan pleaded. "Let us in. We brought a gift for the baby. For James." The son's name on his mother's lips made Emily falter. Slowly, he opened the door. Susan and David were noticeably older. Susan had put on weight and had deep dark circles under her eyes. David seemed smaller, hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. "My God," Susan whispered, looking at little James. He's beautiful." Little James looked at the strangers curiously but without fear. Emily took him in her arms, instinctively protective. "What do you really want?" asked Emily coldly. David cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Daughter, we made a mistake. A terrible mistake. We were shocked, angry, and reacted badly." "Bad?" Emily repeated incredulously. "You kicked me out of the house 3 months pregnant. They left me on the street with nothing." Susan began to cry. I know it was horrible. But we miss him every day. We want our family back." Emily studied the faces of her parents. There was repentance there, but there was also something more. An anxiety, an urgency that did not combine with simple nostalgia. "You saw the report on TV, didn't you?" said Emily slowly. David and Susan looked at each other quickly. "What report?" asked David, trying to sound casual. "The report on the Kennedy heirs, about how they're looking for James Jr.'s kids." The silence that followed was eloquent. Susan stopped crying. David looked away. "You only came here because you knew James might be rich," Emily continued, her voice growing in intensity. "If it was just the son of the slut teenager, you wouldn't even be here." "It's not like that, Emily," Susan tried to protest. "That's exactly how it is." Emily burst out. "For 2 years, you didn't want to know if I was alive or dead. They didn't want to know if their grandson was okay. But now that there is the possibility of money..." At this moment, there was a firm knock on the door. Emily opened it and found 2 men in dark suits. "Miss Helena Sanchez." "Miller?" "I'm Robert Kennedy Sr.," the older man said, removing his hat. "And this is my lawyer, Dr. Hamilton. Can we talk?" Emily felt the world spin. He was face to face with one of the most powerful men in the state. And he was at his humble door. Robert Kennedy Sr. was a man in his 60s, with gray hair and piercing blue eyes, the same eyes as James Jr. and little James. There was a natural dignity to him, but also a deep sadness. "Please come in," Emily said. Still in shock, David and Susan were paralyzed when they saw who had arrived. Suddenly, they felt very small in the presence of this man. Robert Kennedy looked directly at little James, who was still on Emily's lap. His eyes filled with tears. "He has my son's eyes," she said in a choked voice. "It's the same face shape that James had when he was a baby." The lawyer opened a briefcase. "Miss Helena Sanchez, Miller DNA tests have confirmed that his child is indeed Mr. Kennedy's granddaughter. This makes her the legal heir to a significant part of the family fortune." David and Susan approached, trying to join the conversation, but Robert Kennedy completely ignored them. "Miss Helena Sanchez." "Miller," Robert continued, "I'd like to get to know my grandson better, and I would like to make sure that he has all the opportunities that my son would have wanted for him." "Of course," David said, intruding. "We are the grandparents too. We have always supported our daughter and grandson." Emily turned to her father with eyes full of fury. "Have you always been supportive, always?" Robert Kennedy observed the family dynamic with increasing interest. "Sorry, but are you..." "We're Emily's parents," Susan said quickly. "James's maternal grandparents." "That's interesting," Robert said slowly. "Emily, can you tell me about the support your parents gave you during your pregnancy and James's early years?" Emily looked at her parents, saw the despair in their eyes, and made a decision. "In fact, Mr. Kennedy, when I found out I was pregnant, my parents kicked me out of the house. They said I had to choose between aborting or leaving home. I spent months in a homeless shelter. James was born while I was completely alone." The silence in the room was deafening. Robert Kennedy looked at David and Susan with an icy expression. "And where have you been in the last 2 years?" he asked. David tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. "They only showed up here today," Emily continued, "after they saw on TV about the inheritance. For 2 years they didn't care if I was alive or dead, if James was okay or in need of something." Robert Kennedy slowly stood up. "I see. Dr. Hamilton, please take note of that." He addressed David and Susan in a voice that cut like ice. "Gentlemen, you have abandoned a pregnant daughter and an innocent grandson." They acted with cruelty and cowardice. "And now they appear here attracted by the possibility of money?" "Mr. Kennedy," David tried to explain. "We were shocked. We didn't know how to react." "Silence," Robert cut off. "You have had 2 years to reflect and seek forgiveness. They only came here because they knew about the inheritance. This is not family love, it is pure greed." He turned to Emily. "My dear, I lost my son, but I gained a daughter-in-law and a grandson. If you let me, I'd like to be the grandfather James deserves, and I want to make sure you are never in need again." Emily began to cry. I would love that." Robert smiled and gently touched little James's face. "And you, little one? Would you like to meet Grandpa?" Little James smiled and stretched out his arms, as if he recognized the kindness in the stranger. David and Susan tried to get closer once more, but Robert put himself between them and Emily. "You lost the right to be in this family when you abandoned a pregnant child," he said firmly. "Emily is of legal age now and can make her own decisions about who she wants in her life. But as for me and my family, you are not welcome." He turned to Emily. "It's your decision, dear. If you want to give them a second chance, I'll respect it. But know that you and James will always have a home and a family with us, unconditionally." Emily looked at her parents. He saw the desperation, the barely concealed greed, the sudden change in behavior that coincided perfectly with the discovery of the inheritance. "You had years to look for me," she said calmly. "Years to apologize, to meet your grandson, to be a real family. They only came here when they heard about the money. That tells me everything about the kind of love you have for me." She turned to Robert Kennedy. "Mr. Kennedy, James and I have accepted to be part of your family. And as for my parents, they made their choice 2 years ago. Now I do mine." Susan fell to her knees begging. "Emily, please. We are your family. You can't abandon us." "You abandoned me first," Emily replied emotionlessly. "When I needed you the most, they threw me on the street. Now that we don't need you anymore, you want to come back. Sorry, but it's too late." David tried one last card. "You're going to regret that, Emily. Family is family." Robert Kennedy took a step forward. "The only thing she'll regret is that she wasted so much time worrying about people who didn't deserve her consideration." And so, as David and Susan walked out of the house empty-handed and hearts full of remorse, Emily hugged little James and looked at Robert Kennedy, the grandfather her son never had, the father she'd always wanted. Justice had been done. True love won over greed, and a new family was born from the ashes of the old. Emily was finally home. Comment family from the heart, so I know you've made it to the end of this story, and mark your comment with a beautiful heart. And just like the story of Emily and little James, I have another exciting narrative to share with you. Just click on the video that is now appearing on your screen and embark on another exciting story. A big kiss and I'll wait for you there.